Imagine you were trained your whole life to believe your enemy is a monster, and then you're captured, and instead of a fist, he offers you an apple. A train cuts across the vast alien sweep of the American Midwest, endless corn and wheat, an impossibly wide sky, the world outside moving in slow, indifferent passes. Inside the cars, Japanese prisoners press against the windows, faces carved into stoic masks. In their heads, their officers' warnings replay like a litany. Americans are barbarians, they will torture you, kill you without honor, and they hold that fear like armor, braced for a violence that may never come. Their faces are grim masks of stoicism, eyes narrowed, jaws tight, bodies folded small against a world that has always told them to expect cruelty. In the hush between rattling wheels and distant fields, their officers' warnings replay like a metronome. Americans are barbarians. They will torture you. They will kill you without honor. Those words aren't information. They're scripture, drilled into muscle and soul. Surrender was taught to be worse than death. Shame is a living thing here. So each man sits like a coiled spring, waiting not for mercy, but for the pain they are certain will come. Surrender back home, it wasn't just defeat, it was a stain on the soul, shame wrapped tighter than any uniform. These men sit like statues of disgrace, shoulders pinched, eyes fixed on some invisible verdict. Trained to prefer death to capture, each heartbeat hammers with expectation, pain, humiliation, an ugly end that will prove them unworthy. Rumors of torture become scripture in their heads. Every creak of the train, every bark of a guard feels like the opening of a sentence. They hold themselves small, already punished, waiting for the cruelty they have been taught is coming. The train slows, screeching to a halt at a small town depot. Through the grime-streaked windows, the prisoners see faces, women with aproned hands, children clinging to fences, old men with caps pulled low. Each face is a test. All their lives they've been fed one lesson: Americans are monsters. The men sit up straighter, shoulders set like weapons, eyes hard as flint. Whispered curses die on their tongues. They roll their lips over the expectation of hatred, preparing for a rage they've rehearsed in nightmares. Outside, quiet domestic life waits, ordinary civilian, unforgiving in its ordinariness and watchful in its calm. But they don't find hatred. They find curiosity, tilted heads, cautious scrutiny, the long, slow blink of people trying to place a face they only know from posters and rumors. The women clutch their children. The old man tips his hat. A teenage boy stares so openly it feels like a dare. No snarled mouths, no spitting, no raised fists. Some faces are wary, shielded by habit and fear, but none are contorted with the viciousness their officers promised. For the men trapped behind the car window, it is a tiny, terrible surprise, the first crack in a lifetime of certainty, and it feels almost as dangerous as any battle. The trucks come to a rattling stop, and the world narrows to a gate, tall, cold, a crown of barbed wire cutting the sky. Men press to the windows and hold their breath. This is the image they've spent a lifetime rehearsing: iron and contempt, the last guarded threshold before humiliation and pain. Boots click on gravel, a watchtower throws a long shadow. They swallow hard, straighten their backs, and prepare for the moment the mask drops and the enemy shows his teeth. In their minds, this is where the facade ends, where mercy dies and punishment begins. Inside, the treatment is shockingly methodical. It's firm, disciplined, but dispassionately fair. Guards don't raise their fists. Their movements are precise counting, clipped orders, measured steps. Men are herded with military efficiency, pushed from one place to the next. No taunts. No gratuitous cruelty. That very absence becomes its own kind of violence, an empty space where they expect a blow and find only procedure. The prisoners stare, uneasy, trying to read routine as either restraint or calculation. They've been trained to wait for punishment. It never comes. Instead, they face paperwork, roll calls, the cold efficiency of a bureaucracy ordered, unfeeling, oddly civilized. The barracks are almost shockingly ordinary, neat rows of bunks, swept floors, sunlight through high windows. Blankets are rough and military issue, not comfort, but not squalor either. They do their job and nothing more. Everything is regimented, assigned spaces, timed lights, the quiet click of routines that should feel familiar to soldiers, and that is exactly what makes it worse. There is structure without spite, discipline without humiliation, no screams, no random cruelty, only efficient order. The men lie awake, trying to map this tidy reality onto the brutal enemy they were taught to hate, and the question lingers, why is kindness doing the guarding? They step into the mess hall expecting the worst, nothing but scraps, insult piled on hunger, but what meets them is ordinary abundance. Ladles of steaming stew, thick slices of bread, bowls of potatoes, more than any of them have seen in weeks. Men who were trained to count their rice grains eat like thieves, furtive at first, then with a slow, guilty relief. A few stare at their plates as if the food might disappear. Others shove it in, ashamed of how fast their hands move. This simple plenty becomes another small betrayal of everything they were taught the enemy who feeds you shouldn't be human. Night falls, and the camp exhales into a different kind of silence. No barking orders now, no distant planes, just the soft chorus of crickets under an impossibly wide sky. Lying on their thin cots, the prisoners press their faces into the rough blankets and listen as the countryside hums around them, a noise that feels unfamiliar and therefore suspicious. On their island homes, nights had been wind and surf and the sharp metallic echo of drills. Here the dark is ordinary, domestic fields breathing, a dog far off, the occasional creak of a porch. In that quiet, their worry grows louder than any sound. What comes next? They huddle under the thin blanket of night, voices low and urgent, trading theories like contraband, each one a way to make sense of what's happening to them. One man leans in, eyes bright with fear, and spits the worst possibility. It is a trick. They fatten us before the slaughter. A deception to lower our guard. The words hang in the dark and settle on everyone like dust. Fear does all the talking now. Every kindness is recast as camouflage. Every ordinary face, a potential blade. The whispering becomes a litany against trust until another voice, calmer and colder, pushes back. Not everyone buys the trick theory. An older man, chin tight, voice like a stone, cuts through the tentative debate and spits his verdict. No, this is not cunning. It is weakness. They are soft. They do not have the spirit for true war. His words are ironclad doctrine dressed as observation. To him, mercy is a failure, kindness a flinch. The barracks quiets. Some men nod, clinging to the map they've been given since childhood. Others shift, unsure. And in the dim, a younger prisoner stares out the window, the memory of curious, unhostile faces already beginning to unsteady what they were taught to believe. He says, nothing, just watches. A younger man with a face older than his years, replaying the strange, curious looks from the station until they blur into a question he has no answer for. All his life he was taught a single story. The enemy is a monster, fear is duty, surrender is shame. Now that story is fraying at the edges. The neat lines have smudged. He feels disloyal even to his own doubt, terrified that believing the kindness might be a betrayal. Still, The image of merciless Americans, once vivid as a flag, is dissolving, and that small, impossible uncertainty sits in his chest like a foreign seed. A camp officer steps into the barracks, and the room snaps to attention. Heads tilt up, shoulders square, breath held like a single held coin. Boots scuff the floor, a pocket watch clicks, and then silence compresses everything. He clears his throat. The words come out clipped, official, like an order you can feel falling on you. A Nisei interpreter rises and translates, cool and precise, each Japanese syllable landing like a verdict. The men listen as if listening for cannon fire, every old lesson tightening in their chests, bracing for whatever comes next. The barracks goes silent. A camp officer steps in. The prisoners snap to attention as the Nisei interpreter turns the words into a blunt sentence. Due to labor shortages, you will be sent to work on the local farms. The line hangs in the air cold. Final. Dread blooms like frost. Farms mean civilians. Outside the camp's rules, there are fathers and brothers who buried sons at Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Islands. There will be no uniform, no command to restrain raw, personal hatred. The men trade dark, stunned looks. This is the real test they've been bracing for. A wave of collective dread washes over the men. The farms, those wide, ordinary parcels of land, suddenly become something else. Territory beyond the neat rules of the camp, beyond masks of military order. Out there, they think, are civilians with names and faces and fresh wounds. Fathers who lost sons at Pearl Harbor, brothers who died on Guadalcanal. There will be no commands, no regulations, no uniformed officers to stop what a grieving neighbor might do. Imagined mobs form in their minds. Silent stares, whispered plans, private revenge. They had trained to face bullets and bayonets. They had not trained for this kind of exposure, for the raw, personal hatred of people who have nothing to lose. These are the very farmers who had watched boys march away and never come back. Sons and brothers cut down at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, on Guadalcanal, men from towns where everyone knew who was missing, and every funeral left an empty chair at the table. In a place like that, grief ferments into something personal. There are no uniforms in the fields, no military codes to tell a hurt neighbor what to do. Out here, punishment looks like a man's own two hands. The prisoners imagine faces they once saw in newsreels, now up close and blazing with a private, simmering hate. They exchange dark looks, the kind that carry a dozen warnings. Eyes flick to fences, to the road beyond the gate, to the thin strip of sky where a mob might appear. Training feeds the silence, stories of fury, of neighbors turned hunters, of honor lost if you show weakness. Breath tightens, hands clench, conversations die into fingernails and measured glances. Each man imagines the worst. Jeering crowds, an unrestrained anger that answers every misstep with violence. This is the moment they've been taught to dread. Here it is the real America, the real test, and the cruelty they were promised feels real enough to taste. Dawn cracks open over the camp. Men stand in tight ranks, hollow-eyed and counted like inventory. Each name called feels like a step toward judgment. Then the trucks arrive, metal hulks rolling up, engines growling, diesel breath hot and sour. Guards nod. The prisoners shift, shoulders tightening. This morning is the line they cross. There is no going back. They are ordered to climb aboard. Each man moves with rigid discipline, faces like carved stone, shoulders squared, as if to hold off whatever comes next. Wood creaks under their boots, straps click, no one talks. A thin, private breath here, a swallowed prayer there. When the truck doors close, there's no turning back. This is the point of no return. As the trucks pull away from the camp, the men sit in bone-still silence, knuckles white around splintered wooden benches. Engines hum, dust rising like a curtain. They fold themselves inward, waiting not for comfort, but for the punishment they feel they earned. Some stare at their boots. One closes his eyes and breathes, bracing for a blow that may never come. The trucks rumbled through the camp gate, metal kissing the lane, and with that last clack of the barrier the world they'd known fell away. Military lines, roll calls, the thin comfort of rules gone. They sat straighter, not from discipline but from a new, colder understanding. They were leaving custody and stepping into enemy soil, where protocol might stop at the fence, and anything beyond could be personal, unpredictable, final. They brace for what they were taught to expect. A mob with pitchforks and torches, faces twisted by grief and rage. The truck tips the last rise and idles in front of a plain farmhouse. They sit like statues, lungs tight, eyes searching the yard for the first sign of violence, anything to prove the story they'd been fed. Silence answers. Instead, there is only quiet. A lone farmer sits on a battered tractor, kills the engine, and watches them approach, no rage on his face, just wary curiosity. His wife pins shirts to a sun-bleached line. Two small children press their noses to the fence, eyes wide and unthreatening. The scene is painfully ordinary, and that ordinariness hits the prisoners harder than any shout could. The sheer, unnerving ordinariness of the scene is the first psychological blow. There is no shouting, no torches, just a sun-baked farmhouse, a lone man killing his tractor's engine, a woman pinning laundry, two children peering from behind a fence. It makes no sense. All the maps they'd been drawn on hatred, vengeance, ritual violence suddenly look like fantasy. Their bodies tighten, waiting for a moment that never comes. Suspicion rises where fear used to sit. The only thing left to do is try to understand this quiet, and then, as if nothing monumental happened, life moves on toward the day's work. The guards hand them hose, shovels, baskets. Metal and wood clatter like an unfamiliar hymn. Under a high, merciless sun, they bend and push, earth giving way to rhythm, dig, lift, toss, simple, brutal, honest. It's the kind of work that wears your hands raw and your thoughts thin, and yet it lands on a strange, familiar beat. The same back-straining cadence of planting, the same sweat and dust, and the quiet communion with soil. For a few hours uniform and rank fall away. No words are needed, only motion. The field speaks a blunt, patient language they already half know. The farmer works nearby, silent as the rows he tends, his hand steady and his gaze occasionally sweeping across the prisoners like a quiet, unhurried inspection. He never speaks. The guards stand at the field's edge, rifles slung, more bored than threatening shifts of posture, idle cigarette breaks watchful but not malicious, an ordinary backdrop to the strange, slow choreography of labor. The sun climbs to its zenith, folding the world in a dry, relentless heat that feels less like weather and more like punishment. Sweat runs into their eyes, stings, soaks the collars of their shirts, and one by one, the men slump into the thin ribbon of shade cast by the truck, wrists limp, breaths loud in the sudden hush, muscles uncoil, faces go slack, not from relief but from exhaustion and a wary, waiting quiet. The guards lounge at the field's edge, bored and watchful, and beyond them, the farmhouse sits like a distant promise, a shadowed shape on the porch that someone seems about to leave. The farmer walks down from the porch carrying a metal bucket. Each step sends a faint clink across the field. The prisoners lift their heads as if a bell has rung, every muscle coiled, eyes fixed on that slow approach. In their minds, the old warnings thunder. Expect cruelty. Expect blood. They ready themselves for the rupture shouts, a lash, a sudden humiliating blow. Instead, he keeps coming, hands empty but for the bucket. Is this the moment the kindness ends? He stops before them, the bucket sloshing against his boot, and for a long, strange second there is nothing but the soft clink of metal and the prisoner's held breaths. He says nothing. He doesn't shout or scoff or motion them away. He simply gestures an almost casual nod toward the pail and sets it down between them. When the lid comes off, it's not murky or awful brackish like they'd imagined, but bright, cool, clean water, catching the sunlight like an accusation. He dips the ladle, scoops water with a casual, ordinary motion, and holds it out. Time seems to compress. The bucket's metal whispers, the sun gleams on the rim, and the world narrows to that outstretched hand and one trembling face. The prisoner freezes every lesson, every furious sermon about Americans ripped through his memory like a shout. An enemy does not offer water to his captive. His fingers curl, his throat tightens. He feels every eye, every code he's ever lived by, pressing on him, and for a heartbeat he cannot tell whether this is mercy or a trap. He hesitates for a heartbeat, then slowly lifts the ladle and drinks cold water sliding down a throat that has been braced for a blow. The farmer watches, his face unreadable but not cruel. There is no triumph in his eyes, only a plain, steady look that makes the prisoner feel naked in a way a beating never did. The simple gift of water cracks something inside him. Confusion, shame, relief, all at once. Mercy, offered without speech or spectacle, feels more disorienting than violence because it refuses the script he's known his whole life, and it changes him before he can name how. That evening, back in the barracks, something in the air had changed. The room hummed. Men who'd been taught to expect cruelty now spoke faster than they could think, voices tumbling over one another as they traded small miracles. A bucket of water lowered without insult, a child offering a peach, a farmer who shrugged instead of punishing. Laughter slipped out, sharp and disbelieving. Hands gestured, faces opened. Old certainties were being questioned over bowls of stew. It felt dangerous and electric. They were eager, confused, oddly grateful, and above all, trying to make sense of a day that had shown them an enemy who could be human. Back in the barracks that night, they circled the small miracles like men trying to piece together a puzzle. "He gave us water from his own well," one says, voice low with disbelief. "His children watched us. They were not afraid." The words hang there so ordinary and impossible at once because everything they'd been taught screamed that the enemy would spit on them, not offer refreshment. To see small hands unafraid, to drink from a neighbor's bucket, unsettles something deeper than hunger. It cracks a certainty, exposes a new, slippery question. What if their image of America was a lie? Back in the barracks, the mood turns brittle. Skeptics snap. It's a performance. They want to make us complacent. The words cut the silence, but not the doubt. They sound rehearsed, even as they try to steady fraying nerves. Others fall quiet, eyes fixed on imagined traps, a ladle of water that hides a blade, a child's wave that masks a lynch mob. Yet in the gaps between sentences, memories creep in. The farmer's steady shrug, the boy's peach. Those images don't fit the story they were taught. A hard, dangerous question settles over the room. Why would an enemy practice mercy? Days turn into weeks, and the rhythm sets in sunrise. Sweat, the steady scrape of metal on earth, so steady it almost becomes another language. The men move like a shared machinery, heads down, hands working, eyes flicking up to measure the farmer's distance, the guard's boredom, the children at play. There's no shouting, no cruelty, only small, bewildering courtesies. A bucket left by the truck, a quiet nod across the field, a fruit placed just beyond reach. Each gesture lands like a question in their chests. They grow stronger and more confused. The routine feels safe. Dangerous things often start that way softly, unnoticed until one small accident breaks the pattern. The real turning point arrives not with a speech or a gift, but with a tiny, ordinary accident. A young prisoner, bone-tired and clumsy from the sun and the rhythm of unending labor, swings his shovel, and the wooden handle shatters with a sharp, humiliating crack. Time seems to hiccup the clatter of metal, the sudden quiet of the field, the way every head lifts to look, and for a beat, he knows exactly what his army taught him will follow. A brutal, immediate punishment. He drops the pieces and bows his head, waiting for the blow that should, by all logic, end him. He freezes. The field goes suddenly quiet. Shovels paused mid-arc, eyes snapping to him. In his world, a snapped tool wasn't a mishap. It was an offense. He can still hear the bark of officers, the razor-thin rules. Damage equals punishment, and punishment meant a beating, at minimum, sometimes worse. He drops the pieces, bows his head, every muscle braced, waiting for the blow that in his life has always followed a mistake. The shovel hits dirt, and he crumples inward, chin to chest, staring at the jagged wood like it could explain what just happened. He bows his head, an instinctive apology, because in his world an accident is a crime and punishment follows fast. Silence presses in. The field seems to lean toward him. Every muscle tightens. He curls his hands, squares his shoulders, breath held, waiting for the farmer or guard to move, braced for the blow he has been taught is coming. Time seems to stop. Dust motes hang in the sun, the broken handle at the young man's feet like an accusation. Every neck is craned, every breath shallow. In their world, a snapped tool earns a fist. The farmer stoops slowly, lifts the two splintered pieces, studies them as if weighing a life, and the field holds its breath, waiting to see what shape punishment will take. Silence stretches. The prisoner waits, shoulders coiled, waiting for the swing he was trained to dread. The farmer studies the splintered wood, then him, and for a long, taut moment does nothing. No shout, no raised hand, no ritual of punishment. He simply shrugs, a small, almost casual motion that breaks like a bell. It has no cruelty, no lecture. It offers something worse, or perhaps truer, the recognition that mistakes happen. The shrug robs the prisoner of the only dignity he expected in disgrace, and in that empty, human response, something inside him shifts, deep and uncomfortable. Then the farmer turns, walks to his barn, and comes back with a fresh shovel. He hands it to the trembling man without a word, a plain, practical mercy, and with a small sweep of his arm, points back to the rows waiting under the sun. The men return to the field. The silence that follows feels heavier than any strike. That night the barracks felt different, closer, smaller, as if every breath had been sucked into the same quiet. The young man sat on his cot and finally spoke, voice cracking and raw, the words spilling out like something too heavy to hold, his quiet shrug. It brought me more shame than any beating ever could. The room went still. Men who had trained to swallow fear now swallowed something harder. Shame not from punishment, but from being seen as fallible, as human. That single, ordinary refusal to punish had undone a lifetime of doctrine. It lodged in their chests and changed the way they looked at everything. It was a moment of profound recognition. The farmer's shrug, so small, so ordinary, wasn't pity, wasn't contempt. It was an admission that people break, tools fail, mistakes happen. For men raised to see an enemy as vermin or a dishonored creature, that shrug landed like a verdict. We are human. Shame hit harder than any blow. Humility, not humiliation, settled in. In that instant, the rigid code they'd carried softened around the edges. The world they knew black and white, honor and rage blurred. And with that single, silent gesture, something essential shifted inside them, opening a space for something entirely new. After the shovel, everything shifts. Tiny walls crack. On the surface, it's almost invisible. Fewer hard stares, fewer clipped orders, less of that rigid distance that marked every movement. Men who had braced for blows now trade a look and a half-smile. Farmers slow their pace and walk among them, offering water without ceremony. Tasks get shared with a lighter rhythm, a handed rope, a wordless adjustment of a load, a guard who notices and looks away rather than scowls. Respect doesn't explode, it settles, quiet and steady, easing fear and making room for small human gestures that will soon follow. One afternoon, the farmer's wife leaves a wicker basket at the field's edge. Inside, crisp red apples. A small, silent gift, no speech, no ceremony. The men look up, uneasy and astonished, sensing that this quiet kindness changes everything in a single, simple act. Another day, the farmer's boy, small, sunburned, jaw tight with nerves edges up during a break, thrusts out a fuzzy peach with both hands, then bolts back to the fence before anyone can move. For a heartbeat, every man freezes, then uncertain smiles. Those small gifts, an apple left on the fence, a peach offered by a shy child, a basket sitting quietly at the field's edge, worked like cracks in a dam, and what poured through was messy and unexpected. Confusion, shame, a hot flare of gratitude, and then something softer, almost guilty, like relief. The prisoners watched these ordinary acts and felt their neat, carved image of the enemy splinter. Here were people who whistled while they worked, who worried about rain, who kissed a child's forehead, people, not monsters. The propaganda that had kept them whole began to unravel, and with it came the first trembling questions. They start seeing them as parents, spouses, workers, faces with stories, not caricatures. When the farmer glances up at the sky, it isn't a battle calculation. It's the small panic of a man praying for rain. The wife's pride as she watches her children tumble in the yard is the same quiet pride any mother knows. A child's laugh, calloused hands that mend fences, churn butter, patch a boot. These small, ordinary details strip away the slogans and the training, replacing propaganda with human texture, freckled forearms, tired smiles, a newspaper folded on the porch, and that ordinary humanity unsettles the prisoners like nothing else. They are just like them. The realization hits slow, and then all at once men who wake before dawn, who fear drought as much as bombs, who joke about sore backs and brood over children's futures, ordinary human rhythms that don't care for propaganda. It's terrifying because it shatters the story they were told about honor and enemies, and liberating because it offers a way out, to see a face instead of a target. For some, it feels like betrayal. For others, like rescue. Questions rush in. What is honor now? How will we explain this at home? And then, almost shyly, the first gestures toward real communication appear. Communication starts tentatively, like two people testing a shaky bridge. First, with gestures, a prisoner jabs at a heavy sack, grunts, every movement edged with caution. The farmer watches, then gives a slow, deliberate nod, plain as a handshake, as if saying, "I see you." That single, quiet acknowledgement cracks something open, sudden, simple proof they can be understood. It's small, almost awkward, but enough to turn suspicion into a fragile, shared rhythm in the field. A few of the younger prisoners, the ones who'd learned a scrap of English at school, finally decide to try. It's small, awkward, brave. A farmer points to a stack of hay and says, simply, "Heavy," his hand measuring the load and the work. The word hangs there, plain and useful, and for a single instant, two worlds connect over one awkward syllable. He fumbles the word hebi. The farmer's face softens into a surprised smile. A laugh bubbles out, first awkward, then honest, and it rolls across the field like something new. For the first time since capture, they laugh together, and that single sound cracks something open between them. During breaks, they kneel in the dust and draw small, deliberate pictures that carry entire lives. One man scratches the outline of Mount Fuji with a stick, careful and exact, as if the curve of that mountain could steady him. Another maps his family with stick figures and names. A house, a tiny boat that means a father gone to war. No words are needed. The dirt becomes a language. Laughter bubbles up over a badly drawn dog. Fingers point, eyebrows lift, memories surface. The drawings bridge the silence, and the farmer watches, then leans forward and uses his hands to explain the ocean, vast, impossible, but suddenly imaginable. The farmer points to the sky, then draws a slow, enormous circle with both hands, trying to show the ocean's impossible span, the smear of water that keeps them apart, and the prisoners watch, some skeptical, some suddenly quiet. One traces a line in the dirt from the rough sketch of Mount Fuji toward the farmer's circle, another cups his hands to show a tiny boat, and for the first time the distance between maps becomes a feeling in their chests, not just a word. It's clumsy and human and oddly intimate, a moment where geography is translated into gesture and something like understanding slips between them. In those small pauses under the hot sun, dirt caked under fingernails, they stopped being captor and captive. The labels dropped away. One man traced Mount Fuji in the soil, another sketched the outline of his family, while the farmer pointed skyward and made a big circle with his hands to explain the ocean between them, a halting English word. A crooked smile, a laugh that surprised everyone. For those minutes they were not American and Japanese. They were just men from different lands, fumbling to translate lives with gestures and drawings, building a fragile bridge of understanding that felt both terrifying and utterly necessary. Back in the cramped barracks, the change didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived like a slow leak that empties a room. Men who had once worn conviction like armor now found the plates rattling. Conversations that had been ritualized into silence loosened into frantic whispers. Some clung harder to the old words honor, duty. The emperor, as if repetition could stitch the rupture together. Others sat stunned, palms raw from work, replaying a farmer's shrug or a child's shy offering like proof that everything they'd been taught might be wrong. Bonds of discipline strained into suspicion and shame. Identity itself felt unmade, and the barracks swelled with questions nobody knew how to answer. Everything their instructors had hammered into them, the enemy as vermin. The only acceptable answer, a crushing, merciless strike, now clashes with what their own eyes keep insisting is true. The man who handed them water, the silent shrug when a shovel broke, the child who offered a peach. These small, ordinary gestures refuse to fit the monster mold. Each moment is a tiny betrayal of doctrine, an image that gnaws at the neat lines of honor they'd been taught. It doesn't just confuse them, it shakes the foundation of who they thought they were. Back in the barracks, that shaking will turn into questions, ugly, urgent, unavoidable ones. The conversations in the barracks shift less about tactics, more about meaning. Arguments turn inward, slow and urgent. What is honor? They ask each other. What is strength? They quote, the old lessons: brutality equals power, an iron will, never showing mercy, and then they stare at one another, trying to reconcile those words with a farmer's quiet shrug or a hand offering water. Voices rise, then hush. The debate is messy and fierce because it threatens their identities. If strength isn't cruelty, then who are they? It's the first time many of them have had to imagine a different kind of courage. Now they begin to wonder if true strength lies somewhere they never expected. Maybe it's not the roar of guns or the rigid discipline they've been taught to admire. Maybe it lives in a farmer's shrug when a tool breaks. Maybe it lives in a ladle of cool water held out without a word. Maybe it's in the quiet decision to treat another human being with dignity instead of spit and fury. The thought unsettles them. It undermines doctrine, unnerves pride, and opens a crack where doubt can creep in, slow, almost gentle, but impossible to ignore. They begin to see that strength isn't measured only in steel and firepower, not just in the endless factories or the thunder of bombers overhead. It's quieter than that. It lives in a farmer who shrugs at a broken shovel, in a woman who leaves apples at the edge of a field, in a hand that offers a ladle of cool water without a question. Those small, steady acts, dignity, patience, refusal to humiliate, feel like a different kind of power. It disorients them. It reframes honor. And it forces a terrible, thrilling question. What does it mean to be truly strong? Then the announcement comes, flat and official, carried down the line from the camp command like a verdict. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. For a moment nobody moves. The words hang in the barracks like smoke-thin, impossible to grasp, and everywhere at once. Faces that had learned to set like iron for battle go slack. Relief flickers, then is swallowed by something heavier. Shame, disbelief, a small private grief for an honor that no longer exists. Conversation stumbles and fails. Each man turns inward, thinking of ruined homes, stunned fathers, an empire that has folded, and of the impossible truth they will now have to carry home. The announcement lands with the force of something they'd been taught to fear, and instead of noise, there is a complex, heavy silence that flattens the room. No cheering, no cries of victory, only small, private reactions. A hand to a face, a slow exhale, a soldier staring at the floor as if the words were a stranger. Relief comes and is swallowed almost immediately by something heavier: national defeat, the collapse of a story that defined their lives, and a personal shame that feels like a physical weight on the chest. Stoic masks crack, old certainties wobble. For the first time, they do not know where to stand. Their world, the imperial Japan they'd sworn to die for, has collapsed. The flag they fought under is a memory, the promises of honor and unquestioned duty exposed as ruins. They stand as survivors of a disgraced army, hollowed by defeat and shame, clutching uniforms that feel too large for their battered identities. Home is a rumor of smoke and broken roofs. The maps in their heads are smudged by loss. They prepare to go back not as victors, but as men carrying the weight of surrender, uncertain how to explain what they now know about the enemy or how to face what awaits in a nation that has been shattered. They leave the fields not just with calloused hands and a ruined country ahead, but carrying a quiet, impossible secret, an uncomfortable truth about the men who fed them, handed them water, shrugged at mistakes, offered fruit like it meant nothing at all. It's the kind of story that will sound like fantasy back home, or worse, a betrayal. How do you tell people that the barbarian showed you mercy? How do you confess that you learned something about honor from the very people you were trained to hate? So they fold the memory inward. They lock it behind silence and shame, a private light they dare not speak of, because the world waiting for them will not understand. In those last days on the farms, the work didn't stop, but everything else did. Muscles moved out of habit, hands hoed, hose rose and fell, sun baked skin until faces were masks of quiet. Where laughter once broke the monotony, there was now a low, careful silence, little looks exchanged, a hand that lingered a second longer on a water bucket, a boy's soft wave at dusk. They all knew why the mood had changed. The war was over, and with that came shame, relief, and a new story no one back home would believe. So they worked, quietly, keeping time with the fields and the knowledge that this strange chapter was nearly over. The small talk ceases. The pictures in the dirt are no longer drawn. Only the steady, anonymous rhythm of the work remains, hose biting earth, sweat drying on sunburned backs, the faint creak of a tractor in the distance. Men move by habit now, hands remembering tasks while their minds catalog faces, the farmer's quiet nod, the wife's basket of apples, the child who once offered a peach. Those tiny human proofs of decency loop through their heads like a prayer. They exchange no words, what needed saying has already been lived, but each silent stroke of the shovel marks the closing of this strange, impossible chapter. The day of their final departure arrives like a punctuation mark, sharp, unavoidable. The same trucks that once shoved them into the unknown sit now in neat rows, engines quiet, waiting to carry them away. Men who braced for mobs instead move with a strange, solemn poise, shoulders squared not in defiance but in resignation. There is no talk of triumph, no promises of glory, only the small, heavy rituals of leaving, straps tightened, inventory checked, a last look at the fields that taught them kindness. The road ahead is long, the ocean wider still, and every step toward home feels both like relief and a quiet unraveling. They line up to board, rigid rows and silence. Then the farmers appear, simple figures at the edge of the land. The man in a dusty shirt, his wife in an apron, two small children clinging to the fence. Sun cuts the field. No cheering, no scowls, just people who saw the work done. The farmers don't call names or give speeches. They stand, mute and steady, watching the men they've seen each don the rough hands, the bowed heads. For a moment, distance is not measured by flags but by a quiet, shared look. There are no grand speeches, no tearful parades of words. The language that could have explained years of fear, shame, and strange gratitude simply isn't there, nor is the cultural practice that would let men unburden themselves in public. So everything important gets compressed into tiny things: a held look, a lowered gaze, a hand that lingers a beat too long on a fence post. The prisoners, still bound by protocol and wounded pride, cannot ask for pity. The farmers, polite and private, refuse to theatricalize forgiveness. What passes between them is quiet, precise, and human small rituals that mean more than any oration ever could. The farmer meets their eyes and holds them like he's measuring something only time can explain. He gives a slow, deliberate nod. No flourish, no speech, just a small, exact motion that somehow holds a lifetime of meaning, respect, recognition, a quiet verdict. It's a man-to-man gesture, humble and final, the kind that doesn't try to erase history, but refuses to be defined by it either. For a heartbeat, the world narrows to that nod, and the prisoners feel it settle over them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they have been seen, not as enemies, but as people. His wife gives a small, hesitant wave, an awkward human gesture that says more than words. One of the children, the shy boy who'd offered the peach, mirrors it, fingers fluttering, a tiny, brave goodbye that breaks something inside the prisoners. There is no big speech. The farmer leans forward, his voice low and weathered, and says a few words, something like, "God go with you." The prisoners don't know the language. They don't catch the grammar or the accent, but they hear the intent: blessing, farewell, a request for safe passage. Tone carries more than words. In that quiet moment, years of propaganda and fear meet a single human gesture, and it unravels them a little. The sentiment needs no translation. It lands in their chests like a small, unexpected mercy. They meet his eyes, and, for a beat, they understand. Then, in a small, almost private moment, a few of the prisoners, stiff with habit, trained to look away, did something they had been taught never to do. They returned the gesture. Not with speeches, not with fanfare, but with a slight, careful bow of the head. It cracked the armor of protocol. It carried shame and thanks, duty and surprise. A silent sentence that meant, simply, "I see you." The farmer's slow nod answered the same truth. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to two men recognizing one another's humanity. The trucks idled. The men rose and climbed aboard. The trucks pull away, wheels kicking up a cloud of dust, the farmhouse shrinking against the vast blue. Figures at the fence, father, wife, a child with sticky fingers, watch until the trucks are dust. Inside, the prisoners sit still on wooden benches, hands folded, faces smoothed into the empty masks soldiers learn to wear. They do not look back. Not because they don't feel anything, but because the small human things they received, water, a shrug, a stolen peach, cannot be reconciled with the language of honor they were taught. So they stare forward and carry the quiet memory with them. Weeks later, on a rolling transport ship cutting across the Pacific, the men stand at the rail and stare at an impossible blue that stretches to the horizon, their homeland still a distant promise. They are quiet, not from peace, but from the heavy work of memory images of a farmer's ladle, a shrug in the heat, a child offering a peach, small mercies threaded through days of labor. The war that shaped them is over. The shame still sits in their bones. Yet alongside it sits something stranger and fiercer, a new kind of strength, forged by simple kindness, a story none at home will believe, but one they will carry like a private compass. On that cold deck, they let the ocean's vastness do its work, hours of gray water and sky that empty your head and force thoughts to surface. They had been captured. They had been defeated. They had been imprisoned. Those facts sat like stones in their chests. And yet memories kept rising. A ladle of water, a farmer's shrug, a child offering a peach. How do you carry shame and gratitude at the same time? How do you go home to a country that sees you as the enemy and tell a story of unexpected kindness? The paradox doesn't vanish. It travels with them, a quietly dangerous truth across the Pacific. And yet, in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by people who had every reason to despise them, they were treated not as monsters, but as men. It was small things that did the work. A ladle held out in a blistering field, a farmer's indifferent shrug when a shovel snapped, a child's shy offering of a peach, gestures with no fanfare, no headlines, only simple human decency. Those moments dug at the old walls of anger and doctrine. Shame arrived where hate was expected. Dignity arrived where brutality had been promised. They left the fields changed, carrying a quiet, dangerous truth they would have to reconcile with the world they were going home to. They had discovered a fundamental truth, that even in the darkest of times, compassion can exist. It arrived not as a headline or a treaty, but in small, disarming acts, water handed by a quiet farmer, a shrug that refused to punish, an apple offered without expectation. Each gesture chipped away at the story they'd been taught, forcing a private reckoning. Enemies could be people, and mercy could be a form of strength. It didn't erase defeat or the horrors behind them. It simply opened a different door, one they would carry home, a dangerous, unbelievable seed that would quietly reshape how they understood honor, power, and the other side. In the end, they learned something the textbooks never taught them. Small mercies can change the shape of a life. A ladle of water handed across sun-baked palms, a farmer's quiet shrug that refused to humiliate, a child's shy offering of an apple. None of those gestures stopped bombs. None of them rewrote treaties. But they did something far stranger and harder. They eroded the habit of hate. They loosened the old armor of certainty, opened a space where shame, curiosity, and respect could begin to grow. Not a miracle, not a pardon, just a different path, offered in the plainest human language: kindness. It doesn't erase the war, the loss, or the hatred. It doesn't undo the names carved into memory, the burned towns, the long, stubborn shame. But it offers an alternative, a different path, quieter and harder in its honesty. Not a blanket forgiveness, not a tidy ending, but a stubborn possibility that ordinary people can choose decency when every reason points to revenge. That choice does something to a man. It doesn't make him soft. It remakes what strength can be. The prisoners would carry that contradiction home, a small, impossible story of water, a shrug, an apple that might, in time, outlive the reasons for war. It didn't make them weak. If anything, it forged them. Those ladles of water, those shrugged shoulders, the apple offered without ceremony, each small mercy became a kind of training for the heart, teaching restraint where brutality had been taught, teaching courage where obedience had been worshipped. They learned to carry shame without letting it harden into hatred, to hold once absolute truths lightly enough to be changed. Strength showed up not as a roar but as a steady, stubborn quiet. The choice to see a man instead of a monster, to return home with a story no uniform could explain, and with a new, dangerous clarity about what real power looks like. It didn't give them guns. It gave them a way to see. Suddenly the tidy certainties of training, who was honorable, who was monstrous, began to fray. They had crossed an ocean and found people who offered water, work, small kindnesses, ordinary gestures that did not fit the script of the enemy they'd been taught to hate. That contradiction hit harder than any bullet. It forced questions they couldn't answer back home. How do you return to a country that expects you to be ashamed when your hands know the shape of a farmer's nod? That strange, quiet understanding became both a burden and a kind of armor, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their war ended not with a bang, but with a quiet revelation that would ripple through the rest of their lives. What started as a single ladle of water and a farmer's indifferent shrug had pulled a thread through their tightly woven beliefs, loosening armor they didn't know they wore. Back home, they would walk among ruins and relatives and find that some truths couldn't be spoken, others could not be kept. The memory of ordinary hands offering ordinary kindness would haunt decisions, reshape ideas of honor, and soften the hardness that war had taught them. It was a small revolution inside each man, subtle and unstoppable, as the ship slid forward into an uncertain future. The ship sails on, carrying them toward an uncertain future in a broken land. On deck, the ocean is a flat, cold mirror. Distant lights of home glimmer like cliffs they cannot yet reach. Men stand shoulder to shoulder, silent, hands clasped or tucked into sleeves, staring at water that separates what they lost from what waits. They are not the same boys who left. Somewhere between the farmer's quiet nod and the ladle of water, something shifted. A new, dangerous knowledge has lodged in their chests. Hope arrives wrapped in shame. Memory rides with them, heavy as sea-churned crates, impossible to leave behind. But they also carry an invaluable, unbelievable story, a testament to the surprising resilience of the human spirit, a ladle of water offered without malice, a farmer's quiet shrug instead of a blow, a child's shy peach and an apple left on a fence, small human gestures that chipped away at a lifetime of hatred and left something harder and truer in its place. It won't undo the loss, the shame, or the wrecked cities waiting at home, but it rewired how these men would see the world. It became a seed of doubt about the stories they'd been fed, and a stubborn, private proof that compassion can outlast bullets. That experience became a quiet, stubborn lesson. Never accept the enemy your leaders hand you without looking, because behind every uniform is a human story. Small things, water from a ladle, a shrugged apology, an apple handed across a field unraveled a war's worth of hatred faster than any speech. It didn't erase loss or change history, but it showed that compassion can cross barbed wire. So when someone tells you who the enemy is, pause, ask questions, look for the person on the other side of the line. That's the kind of surprise that stays with you long after the ships have sailed.